Good morning. You're here. That's impressive. How many went for the gala dinner? Oh, nice, nice. Clap for yourselves. You're here, nice and early. Okay, so good morning and welcome to day 3. This is the 3rd day. And as we know, great things always happen on the 3rd day, the 3rd and final day. So let's check in about day 2. My son, I also have 2 sons, like Mabongi, who was here. They keep on telling me that we should play a game, but that game is always a trick. I don't know if you've heard of this game. They say, we listen, we don't judge. So yesterday, at the gala dinner, we literally watched, but we don't judge. Is that okay? No judging. That's how we do it. And what happened there stays there. Okay. And one of my panelists actually for today was asking me, because later at the end of the day, we are going to have the taking stock, looking at what are the lessons that came out. So he came and asked, so how do you want me to report about the gala dinner? That was funny. Anyway, so as we get on to the discussion for today, I want to remind you to sign in. Most people never signed in for day 1. These are 3. So they'll go around again. There's day 1, day 2, and day 3. So you still need to sign in for each and every day that you are here for accountability. And then there are lots of photos that have been taken, pictures of you. As you go out, there's a QR code on the registration desk or on the screens. You can be able to download your nice photos. They're available for you to use. An announcement for the poster presenters. If you had a poster, we are going to take down the posters at 10:30. So once we finish this plenary, as we go for tea, we are starting actually 10 minutes late, so we may either catch up or just get some 10 minutes into your tea break, but whatever time we break, hopefully we won't go beyond 10 minutes. Please go to the poster and your poster and we'll take it down with you. My colleagues have been monitoring social media, so X, LinkedIn. I have seen many of you, so the competition is quite stiff. We have amazing prizes for you, so keep sharing your posts on social media. And as you share, also show up for the closing plenary. Because if we call out your name and you're not here, then we hand over to the next person. We have no way to get your prize to you. So be ready to come back. Okay, that said, let me take you now to day 3. Today we are going to look at generating and measuring impacts on gender equality and social inclusion in agri-food systems. And to take us through this topic, we do have subject matter experts in the room. And so at this point, it's my pleasure to welcome Diana Lopez-Avila, who is Senior Scientist at the Gender Accelerator, to take us through this session by welcoming her speakers. Let's give it for her.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being today in our last day of the conference. So as Vivian said, this plenary is about generating and measuring impact on gender equality and social inclusion in agri-food systems. Over the past 2 days, it has been discussed and emphasized not only in the plenary sessions, but also in the different parallel sessions we have attended, the importance of finding solutions to improve gender equality and inclusion and enhancing and facilitating women's agency. We have heard about the importance of generating evidence that informs policy and investments, and this session will explore and discuss why impact on gender equality and social inclusion is important, how to generate it, and how to measure it. And for us to To go deeper into this discussion, we have a great set of speakers that will bring different perspectives, not only from the research side, but from the donor and the policy side. So let me introduce our first speaker. So I want to introduce Inga Jacobs-Mata. She is the Senior Program Director for Water Growth and Inclusion at the International Water Management Institute, IWMI. Before joining IWMI, Inga was a research group leader for the Integrated Water Solutions Group at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa, where she managed a transdisciplinary team of researchers working on co-development of integrated water solutions in South Africa. So let's give a round of applause for Inga. Thank you. You can take the second seat. Thank you. So let's welcome our second speaker, Lynn Scheider. She is a Senior Program Officer for Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Development at the Gates Foundation. She has over 17 years of experience in international agricultural development and gender equality, including 14 years as a Foreign Services Officer at USAID. During her tenure at USAID, she contributed to the Feed for the Future initiative while serving in South Africa, Malawi, Haiti, Nepal, and Washington, D.C., and held the role of Deputy Director for the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Hub. At the Gates Foundation, Lynn leads strategic investment that advance gender transformative, climate resilient food systems across Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So welcome, Lynn, to the panel. Our third speaker is Malik Abaddi. He is an evaluation senior lead at OCP Nutricrops and a policy manager and delivery lead at JPAL Agricultural Lab for Africa, Ujala. He develops partnerships, manages research pipelines, and leads evidence to policy communication and dissemination. Before joining JPAL, he held leadership and project management roles at the University of Mohammed VI Polytechnique, the Policy Center for the New South, and Search for Common Ground. So welcome, Malik. Our next speaker is Michael O'Sullivan. He is a lead economist and head of the World Bank Africa Gender Innovation Lab, an action-oriented research lab that aims to identify what works to promote gender equality in Africa and use these insights to shape policy. The lab's evidence has informed 12.8 billion in development investments across 53 countries and has shaped multiple policy reforms. Over to you, Mike. And then our last speaker is Jonas Alem. He's a research professor at the School of Economics, University of Cape Town, and director of academic programs and the Environment for Development Initiative. He is also a researcher at JPAL at MIT, and his research lies on the intersection between development economics, behavioral and experimental economics, with a focus on gender, energy transitions, technology adoption, and climate change. Over to you, Jonas. So thanks for all of you to be here. And given that you come from different backgrounds and organizations, I want to start with a question for each of you. And I would like to tell me from your perspective and your experience, what does achieving an impact on gender equality in agri-food systems mean, and how we can effectively achieve and measure this impact. So over to you, Inga, and then we will go around.
Thank you, Diana, and good morning to everybody. It's nice to see so many people here after the dancing last night. So I work for the International Water Management Institute, which is one of the CGIAR centers. And for us, gender equality is one of our 3 core strategic outcomes in our strategy, our 2030 strategy. And that comes alongside mitigating water risks and managing water sustainably. the third outcome being reducing global inequalities. And this is, it's quite explicit in our strategy. We aim to reduce global inequality by ensuring women, youth, and marginalized communities have equal access, equal opportunities to use and manage water resources. Now, in terms of how we achieve the impact, you mentioned that, we operationalize this through various interventions that really try to address the structural barriers to water management. So I would just a few examples. For example, a regional initiative that I led in East and Southern Africa. We were able to work with over 70,000 women agribusinesses, women farmers that were supported with gender-responsive irrigation models, inclusive finance, peer-to-peer mentoring, market access. And this directly not only increased yields, but also raised household incomes. We also have another interesting project, and I know some of the partners are also in the room, where we developed a gender credit scoring tool under our innovation lab for small-scale irrigation, which ensured small financial products were adapted so that farmers can access credit for irrigation, which we know is one of the biggest barriers to irrigation, to water management, and women's entry into water and agricultural systems. Then we also look at leadership, how to promote women leaders into the water sector. And in Nepal, we had, we still have a leadership program where we work with women through a mentorship program to take leadership roles in water, energy, food nexus policy and planning. And then just quickly in terms of how we measure that, how we measure the impact, I mean, we all, within our organizations, within our projects, we have JC indicators. But I would say ours, we're really trying to focus on how we capture shifts in power, access, agency, not just participation, not just looking at how many women are trained, but leadership and decision making. So, you know, the proportion of women in leadership roles in water user associations, in governance bodies, economic empowerment, the number of women accessing credit, irrigation technologies as a result of these credit scoring tools. Digital inclusion is another one of our key indicators. So this is how do we promote inclusivity in how we design digital innovations. And we have a process to do that. And then lastly, I would say norms and attitudes is another one. Now, these are more qualitative indicators, but it's really to look at the evidence of shifts in social norms. We've worked a lot in West Africa, for example, where we support community campaigns, local and religious leaders to challenge gender stereotypes and other exclusionary norms. Now, long story short, all of these project examples, I think for us it's, you know, really about how we try to ask whether women are influencing irrigation policy, whether they are being able to do that, and how does it then benefit more women farmers down the line. So this is what we are doing. Just to close off, this strategic commitment in our strategy that I mentioned earlier on, it's really about how do we reduce the gender gap in water by, you know, our target is 500 million women globally. So it's a big target. It's part of our institutional strategy, and I'm proud to say that it's really central. It's one of the 3 key commitments. Thank you.
Inga. All right, thanks, Diana. So I'm with the Gates Foundation. I just joined at the end of May. I'm fairly new, and I have the good fortune of getting to help spend Bill Gates's fortune on women's empowerment in agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. It's a dream job. And just before I joined the foundation, Bill Gates made a historic announcement. Many of you may have heard this, some may have not, that he decided he would be setting an end date for the foundation, and that he was going to commit the entirety of his fortune, $200 billion, which is an enormous amount, to the foundation, to the investments that he's making primarily in health and agricultural development over the next 20 years. So we suddenly are operating with this 20-year time horizon and $200 billion to spend, which is really a huge amount for a private philanthropy. But also having a time horizon of just 20 years is really unique for a donor, private or otherwise. Having worked for a bilateral donor in the past, you don't have a time horizon. You're sort of always, you're going to be there in perpetuity, right? So this is a unique situation to suddenly have the role of working with this end date in mind, and knowing that we have a big purse, like a big amount of money to spend, but suddenly we're asked to be, it's not a bottomless amount of money. We're asked to be more strategic than ever. We're asked to prioritize more than ever. And we're asked to have greater impact than ever. We're still figuring out exactly what this means for every aspect of our portfolio. The good news is that agricultural development remains one of the top priorities for Bill Gates himself, for the foundation. And within the strategy of agricultural development, women's empowerment is really at the heart of that. And we're working with our research partners to figure out, to still continue to figure out exactly what really works, what is most impactful, and what is most cost-effective to reach women, to empower women, so that we can have the greatest impact on achieving not just women's empowerment in agriculture, that we know that is critical, but in increasing sustainably at scale, increasing agricultural productivity and agricultural incomes. So that is really kind of our focus in a nutshell. So I kind of wanted to just frame it in that way, that the foundation is operating with this like really strategic timeline and this sense of urgency right now. And we see achieving gender equality really not just as a side outcome, and also not just as an end in and of itself, but as something that's central to achieving overall transformation in agri-food systems. It's a key pathway to widespread adoption of agricultural innovations and to productivity gains and income gains across agri-food systems in the countries where we're working. And then just to let you know, in terms of thinking about measurement, the 3 high-level goals that the foundation is looking at tracking now, and I can't tell you exactly what all of the indicators will be under these, because there will be many, and they're not necessarily standardized, but the 3 high-level goals that we're tracking are equitable uptake of innovations by women and small-scale producers, increased and more resilient production of nutritious foods, and equitable economic benefits. These are quite high level. This gives you an idea of the kinds of impacts that we're aiming to achieve. We know that you can't achieve any of those without addressing the underlying gender and social norms that shape who has access to innovations, assets, and decision-making power. We know that you also have to measure who has access to all of those. So we want to really look at ensuring that we're designing for addressing those norms and making sure we're measuring them throughout the life of any intervention that we're funding. We know that in terms of measurement, you need both qualitative and quantitative approaches. That's critical. That's something I want to always share with our research and measurement partners. Measurement is always key to getting it right. Evaluation is critical. Many of you know my predecessor, Vicki Wild, who retired. For those that don't know, many have referred to me as the new Vicki. That is right. That is me. I'm the new Vicki Wild. She's retired and now living on a farm in Italy. And I'm now here to try to fill her shoes. She invested heavily in data and evidence and research and evaluation of this portfolio. which is wonderful, and I want to continue to do that. So that's part of the reason some of you are here as our data and evidence partners and research partners. So thanks to all of you for really helping to build out this portfolio, and we want to continue this collaboration. And then last of all, I just want to say in terms of achieving impact, like I said, because we have this strategic focus over the next 20 years, but really we want to, like the next 5 to 10 is where we really got to push to show that we have this impact so that Bill will want to continue to focus on women's empowerment in agriculture over the full 20. We need to say, working with partners like IFPRI and the Gender Innovation Lab at World Bank, what is the cost effectiveness data? What does it tell us on what is most impactful, what is most cost effective and most impactful in achieving women's empowerment and broad-based ag productivity increases, ag income increases in our target countries, which are like Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, as well as India. But our focus is going to be on those sub-Saharan African countries. We're really focusing in, narrowing for impact. Our CEO, Mark Sussman, actually recently asked my small team of just 3 people working on women's empowerment and agriculture in front of our entire division, he said, I quote, "We need to ruthlessly interrogate what works for women in agriculture, what is most cost effective for women in agriculture to achieve impact." He's like laser focused in on our team and our small amount of resources on what works for women. And so we're trying to respond to him. So I would love to hear ideas that anyone has, and we're really wanting to have our research partners, particularly at IFPRI and Jill, let us know what does work, what is the evidence, and how can we apply it? Thanks.
Thank you. A round of applause. So over to you, Malik.
All right. Thank you, Diana. Good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking from the perspective of JPAL, that's the Abdul-Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, as well as from the perspective of a donor that is OCP and its ecosystem. That's the custodian of a good bit of the world's reserves of phosphate and a pretty big actor in agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, but also worldwide, increasingly so. And so I'll be kind of moving around between these 2 perspectives throughout the conversation today. So for us at a program level, when we talk of impact on gender equality, we're talking about changes in 3 things that to our mind, the evidence tells us are important for women and excluded groups. So first, access to and control over resources, agency in farm and household decisions, and tangible economic outcomes like yield, but also profit. Here an early break, maybe because maybe in this space a lot of the programs that we see are over-optimized by yield, but farmers make their decisions more often than not based on profit rather than a more immediate outcome in yield. In terms of what works, I wanted to surface here 2 designs that have consistently helped. First, maybe self-evident, but for a given household, in your impact measurement, it's often a good idea to target both the men and the women. Analytically, it's a good idea, but also to when doing qualitative work, to surface the lived experiences and the differentials there. Secondly, it's also often, wherever possible, to go for bundles of services. And so in Bangladesh, for example, agronomic training plus gender sensitization training, plus a few other services proved to have a synergetic effect where women reported more empowerment in decision-making in the household and farm levels, more so than the individual components alone. And so what this reminds us of is that information often moves the needle on knowledge and adoption, maybe persistently so. But in terms of empowerment and agency, it might be a good idea to look at bundles of services. This is on the measurement front, and this is on what works. In terms of measurement, what we found at OCP is it's a good idea to go for an explicit theory of change as a living document as opposed to a parked report somewhere, and then build mixed methods around them. And so, for example, this might look like qualitative work to surface barriers, gendered norms, the lived experiences of the people we're targeting, go for process indicators to see whether the women are actually getting the services that are being offered, which can be tricky in this space, and then good quantitative work for outcomes that are decision relevant, like input mix, profits, validated measures for agency. And so in sum, the impact on gender equity, gender equality means that the women are in the room, they're in the data, and they're in the decision-making loop. Thank you.
Thank you, Malik. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Diana. Thanks for the invitation to be here this week with you all. So again, I lead the Africa Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank. We work with government partners and other implementing partners across sub-Saharan Africa to identify and sort of test what works, what doesn't, and then again to shape policy around closing gender gaps. So I think our team is more than 100 impact evaluations at various stages of completion, including more than a couple dozen on agricultural and land, really trying to zero in on sort of those cost-effective approaches. And I think we couple that with diagnostics, descriptive and inferential research, qualitative research, and of course a lot of more and more policy engagement directly with policymakers. And I think when we think about impact, we of course are thinking about, yes, participation and benefiting from programs, but it's really more about how can women benefit more fully from agriculture and food systems. So we're thinking about how they can productively and profitably do so on equal terms, right? So this is about access to income and control over it, similarly with assets, as well as having agency and decision-making. So, I mean, our experience is that this kind of impact happens when these innovations that we co-create with partners really tackle those core constraints, the underlying constraints, and we're intentional about sort of measuring how they work and also what they cost. And I think, one early study in our agricultural portfolio, I was thinking back on this in reflections for this, from Uganda, I think kind of illustrates this point. So this was a study working with women cotton farmers where it was a randomized control trial, so across villages, people were assigned to either receive a social network intervention, which is essentially sort of meet an unfamiliar face in your community with whom you could get a quick info session and then be paired with over the course of an agricultural planting season. Comparing that against a standard agricultural extension training, the combination of the two, and then of course a comparison group. And I think what really struck us from the findings is that this weak tie social network intervention, just on its own, actually lifted production and actually yields at 1/3 the cost of the standard agricultural extension training. So it shows that sort of, these approaches, and this approach also generated positive spillovers for men, shows that there are these approaches that can yield similar or even larger impacts at a lower cost, which is sort of what our counterparts at the World Bank, I see Patricia, I think, in the room, are always keen to sort of put into the design of the next generation of programs. So I think this early example that I'm mentioning, it kind of captures three things that we have increasingly focused on in our impact evaluation work. The importance of diagnosing and kind of addressing these binding constraints to women and gender in the aggregate food sector, explicitly testing mechanisms by sort of having different variants, different treatment arms in these studies, and then doing a better job of capturing the cost effectiveness. So this is not just about impact, but really understanding what is the cost per unit of benefits that could be generated for policy.
Thank you, Mike. And then over to you, Jonas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diana, for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. I want to start with academic literature on behavioral difference between men and women. There's consistent evidence which shows that when women are given the opportunity, the same opportunity as men, they outperform men. Women are less likely to be corrupt in bribery games. We tried that. It was consistent evidence actually in different settings. Actually, women are less likely to be corrupt. Women are pro-social in terms of their behavior. And also, in developing countries, the first two examples that I mentioned, we found them actually consistently even in the West, in Sweden and other countries where I spent the last 20 years. And also microfinance loans are very more likely to be paid back if the woman is the main client. So if this is the case, investment in women empowerment is going to result in a much better benefit for society. Sorry guys, so I'm a father of 2 daughters, so I studied this very carefully. But all these things that I said are on average. It doesn't mean that for everybody, every guy is bad. We have 2 examples that we try to see this difference. In northern Ethiopia, for example, what we did was we invited both men and women, couples, husbands alone, wives alone, and then we asked them to work and earn some money. And then after they earned that money, then went there, okay, hey guys, hold on. So now we know that you have money. We have this improved cook stove that saves fuel by 50%. It reduces indoor air pollution. It reduces women's and children's time to collect fuelwood. And then do you want to buy it? Guess who decided to buy it? The women. The guys wanted to run away with the money. We've also noticed another experiment in Tanzania where we asked, actually it's an intergenerational decision, actually we asked both husbands and wives, actually, okay, I can give you $3 for you or $6 for an investment on children's schooling materials. The guys are more likely to choose the, and also, so we say that actually, I'll give you $3 versus $6, which is twice the amount for the kid. So on average, the guys went with the money, actually with the $3, but mothers are more likely actually to choose the $6 for the kids. So these are really robustly found stylized facts, but the unfortunate fact, especially in many developing countries, women don't have the same access to resources, as in agribusiness, for example, more importantly, land, access to technology, access to credit. Women are very less likely to get all these. So now what should be done is the main question. And then to me, reducing this gender gap is to make sure that women have the same access as men to these kinds of innovations, credit, and many other facilities that are important for their production. But what does that involve? That not only involves material needs or material support, but also changing in the
This is where we're trying to complement our full impact evaluation work, draw on existing administrative or digital data platforms, and answer kind of more narrow operational questions. And I think the ATI example that I just cited is a really good example of that. We're using the existing digital infrastructure to track callback rates, message engagement, sort of, usage rates, et cetera, for faster feedback. I'll lastly just mention a plug for the great work we've been doing with IFPRI on measurement, along with IRC and some other partners. This is a huge piece of the puzzle. If we can't crack things like measuring women's agency, time use, et cetera, a lot of these impact evaluations won't really be able to yield the kind of policy relevant results we're looking for. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. So over to you, Jonas, with some examples, of interventions that have worked and how we can enable the generation of this evidence.
All right, thank you. So there was a review paper actually in the World Bank Research Observer that came out about a year ago, and it reviewed the status of women in South Asian countries for the past 4 decades. The findings are alarming, actually. That paper is a very comprehensive paper. I strongly recommend reading it if you're interested in this topic. And what it finds is, despite the rapid increase in income by families, the status of women actually remained basically the same for 4 decades. In fact, in some places actually it declined, conservatism was actually increasing. So this points to the importance of targeting the institutions and the social norms in a society. 2 important interventions that were, the studies were based on quasi-experimental studies in India by Beeman and co-authors, Minister Dufflo, etc. The MIT group is also a co-author. So what they evaluated is the impact of randomly assigning women village leaders in India. So they find that actually in these places where women were in charge of village administration, because the constitution requires at some places that some seats should be reserved for women. So they use that as an exogenous variation. And they find that actually a couple of years or a few years later, children, like women, girls, especially in those villages, have a higher level of school achievement and also higher level of aspiration. Another related paper that uses the same intervention shows that actually those villages where women were the heads or women the village leaders, they were more likely to contribute to public goods investments like roads, schools, and that benefit directly women. So what we learn from these studies is, of course, the institutional setup is the most important. Very often we focus on the material needs. Okay, how do you increase access to land? But the social, the justice system, the social system, and the social fabric should be changed as well. Land tenure reforms that Mike mentioned as an example. The World Bank has been big in supporting these land tenure interventions. 2 of the ones that I involved is the one in Ethiopia, where we have land certification. So the photos of both the wife and the husband are put in the land certificate. That increased significantly women's status and also agency. The same study also was conducted in Rwanda. So land tenure is an important venue actually in agribusiness related interventions. That in Tanzania, one thing that I wanted to point out is when it comes to household issues and times, communication between couples is very key. Yesterday in one of the panels where Inga, you attended, I noted that actually one intervention is to provide these couples counseling and making decisions together. Because in an experiment, what we did was we asked both husbands and wives to make decisions on children's school investment. So privately first, and then we asked both couples, like the father and the mother, actually, what would your spouse choose? Surprisingly, only 37% of the couples are correct about the beliefs of the other partner. So that clearly means that there's a significant scope for improving household decision-making by simply promoting communication and training couples to make decisions together, because this is not something that we're used to doing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jonas. And we heard about sort of like Jonas and Mike talk us about some of interventions that have been effective. And now I would like to hear, from you, Inga, based on your experience on CGIAR, because we know that the research is a part to generate this impact, but we need sort of like enabling environment. So I would like to ask you, what strategies can organizations like CGIAR adopt to fundamentally embed gender throughout their work and create an enabling environment to generate impact on gender equality in agri-food systems.
Thanks, and I'd like to answer this in a slightly different way than perhaps the panelists, focusing on the research interventions. So let me just ask the audience, how many of you are from CGIAR? Can you just raise your hands? Can I just see brothers and sisters from CGIAR? Okay, is that about a third of the room maybe? Something like that? Okay, so this is more, in solidarity with you and also wanting feedback. I would say that, we have a role to play in working with our government partners, private sector partners, research partners to develop more transformative outcomes. But we can't do that alone. We also have to look internally within our institutions, right? And really be critical and reflexive about the level of inclusivity that we promote and institutionalize. So just to give you an example of IWMI, I mentioned our strategy that we developed, and we have this, strategic outcome, reducing global inequalities. And that set off a whole catalytic effect to develop a JC strategy. And at first, I must admit, the JC strategy was, we need a JC strategy because donors want and expect a JC strategy, right? And we need to have that. But it created this whole new journey for us that became more about really thinking about what do we need to do internally within our organization. So the first thing was to, really articulate what do we expect from our leadership. And that was something in our JC strategy. We have a specific role and task for our leadership to not just, require JC indicators, but to model it, to resource it, to finance it, support it. Another way was to look at how do we've been focusing a lot on women, but also how do we promote youth and social inclusion. So other aspects that came out of it, we developed an early career researchers forum. I know other CGIAR centers also have this, to look at really having a space that is for early career researchers, by early career researchers, and also empower them to make decisions with us, right, as a institutional leadership. And I'm proud to say also as a result of that, we've created a tuition support grant program. It's amazing how many CGIAR centers, we're all focused on research, right? But how many of our centers really enable postgraduate studies? People have to resign to be able to pursue their studies, right? So things like that, they're small, but they are so catalytic, so transformative for an organization. Another one was, and this was actually, championed by our DG. He came up with this concept of youth co-guardianship. I had never heard the phrase before, to be honest. And it was something that we've now embedded in all our major strategic initiatives. It's basically as simple as saying we have to have a youth organization, a youth partner, co-lead an initiative with us. So not just a partner like a government partner or a private sector partner or donor, but actually have a youth co-guardian, a youth co-lead. And again, that's really transformed the decision-making, the discussions that we have. And then I think just on more operational things, which we're trying now, and I'd love to, if there are other examples, love to hear from you all. But something as simple as a JC overhead, right? So like we have overheads for IT or for communications or, that we add on to projects, have a gender and social inclusion overhead that really allows us to ensure that resources are dedicated to inclusion activities, to monitoring, that equity is funded, right? It's not optional. And that was quite the debate within the organization, because We know that, sometimes you're up against other projects that say, well, Jesse is not a priority here. It's not a, there's no time or there's no money. But this really made it mandatory across the board. And what we're working on now as the next step is now to then look at how we roll out gender-responsive budgeting across all of our projects. So really screen all projects for inclusion. And that's something that's coming on. So I think for me, just to conclude, the real innovation is how we hardwire equity into our institutional DNA, that then could have that ripple effect on impact.
Okay, Inga, thank you so much. And then my last question is for Lynn and Malik, because we heard about sort of like what type of evidence have proved effective, but Mike touched upon a bit on how we disseminate this evidence. And I think, in yesterday's panel, it was like how we make the business case, for stakeholders to invest on women and to put women in the center, of agri-food systems. So the question is for you, Lynn, as, representing a donor, and Malik, you're working on policy. What strategy, how can we more effectively translate impact evidence to influence policy and donor investment and advance towards more equitable agri-food systems? So over to you, Lynn.
Thanks, Diana. I want to make one point first for the donors in the room. I touched on this yesterday in the award breakfast session, which is that I think donors also need to continue investing in the evidence generation, but also donors need to build in the flexibility to be able to take up the evidence. I think as donors, we're often very rigid in how we do our project cycles and how we do research, evidence generation, and we do them sort of in parallel. And we aren't able to, when we have a project, we aren't able to always adapt, have that project adapt and take up learning throughout the project cycle, right? So if we have some really important learning, if the project isn't necessarily effectively achieving its goals around women's empowerment, ag incomes, whatever it is, and there's learning happening over here in another realm, then we're not always able to, because of our rigid bureaucratic mechanisms around contracts and grants, right? This is just the reality, and I know this from years of being a donor, including with another agency. We're not able to say, oh, you need to adapt and rapidly start taking this other approach, whether it's because you're actually failing or you're just not using the most effective, up-to-date evidence on what actually works, right? We need to just be flexible. Donors need to be truly flexible and working with our partners, our grantees, on saying, let's be super adaptive, let's constantly be learning, let's encourage our grantees to be learning, taking up the evidence. I think that's really critical, instead of just saying, we're generating learning over here and we're implementing over here, and maybe at the end of a 5-year cycle, we take up the learning. No, we need to constantly be doing it as an iterative process. I hate that we have these cycles where we're not taking up the evidence fast enough. So that's a call to donors. And then to the research community, I would just say, I think you need to maybe do better at speaking to the rest of us, Most of us don't have the time to read all of the peer-reviewed publications, It's really hard. I'm not going to lie, I have the temptation to put them into ChatGPT and say, tell me what I need to know, right? It's really hard to, given all of the other things that I, as a donor who's managing a lot of grants that are not around research and evidence generation, and communicating to my CEO what my portfolio is trying to achieve in the long run and all of these other things, to try to be on top of what is the latest evidence, what do I need to know. So not only, I think, do you all in the research community need to be able to give digestible policy briefs to governments, but also to us as donors. We also don't have the time, the bandwidth, or necessarily always the capacity to be reading through every publication, every impact evaluation report, everything, we're not researchers, most of us. We just don't have the bandwidth. We can't necessarily be doing this. So we need you to be able to make it just more digestible to us and to our leaders. Help us speak to our leaders and communicate this to our leaders. We've got to work together to be able to communicate this to our leaders, to the policymakers and the governments where we work, and then within our own donor agencies. And often, I will say, while I have your ears, sometimes working with the research community, I love you all, but it can feel like pulling teeth to say, how do we make this, how do we translate this to the real world, to the rest of the world outside of the research community? How do we make this feel like something everyone else can understand? So please, let's try harder to do that.
Thank you, Lynn. Over to you, Malik.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna speak in this exact same vein that Lynn just did. I will start though with agreeing that I think translating is a bit of a misnomer because it needs to start way earlier than after the results come in. And so I'll share a couple of examples that at the Applied Lab for Agriculture as part of JPAL, we think are good success stories for projects we're currently running. If you're co-designing, if you're designing for an impact assessment and you don't have the donors represented, you don't have whoever's going to make a decision using the results of your impact assessment represented. You don't have people from the gender teams, from the cost effectiveness analysis teams, maybe from procurement, so you can make sure that that your evidence hits before budget lock and before key moments in the investment cycle. Then you're going to more than likely be scrambling afterwards. As researchers to be heard, as program folks to make sure that your intervention is funded or scaled up later. And so if, a good way to go about avoiding this scramble is to not think of this as translation after the fact, but as a key part that starts at the design phase. So the couple of examples I wanted to share. So at the UM6B JPAL Applied Lab for Agriculture, we're running a project with Hope Mitchelson, Sarah Jensen, and a few of their colleagues with the Tanzania Agricultural Research Institute and SUA for an impact evaluation of soil testing in mainland Tanzania. And so the way they went about this is that moving from a government policy that soils are tested and that soils get input recommendations on a village aggregated level as opposed to individual soil testing. The question is, is it a good idea, is it a good use of public funds to increase the number of soils that are tested per region, per location? And so what they did is they are testing how the villagers react to individual soil tests and tailored recommendations for their own plots versus soil tests and recommendations emanating from their neighbors' plots versus emanating from lead farmers' plots versus the village aggregate, which is the status quo in terms of village recommendation. So we felt this was after a lot of back and forth with TARI, with SUA, with the Ministry of Agriculture, with Ujala and JPAL folks, so that the evaluation is yes going to convert into a paper and a report and good evidence that is going to be publicly available, but it's also crucially going to speak directly to a policy decision. Namely, do we increase the soil testing, or are we doing a good job? Are we getting enough impact from what we're spending right now? And so the second example is in Ghana. So OCP is running a program called Agri-Booster, which is a bundle of services, credit, inputs, extension services, etc. And so we have Edward Esiedu and Robert Osei out of the University of Ghana who are running an impact evaluation that ties directly to the African Union's 2006 commitment to raising input use to 50 kilograms per hectare, which we haven't hit, by the way, but in close to 2026. But the question here is they've separated the farmers into two. One group receives credit soil testing, tailored recommendations, and good agricultural practices training. The other group gets no soil testing and no tailored recommendations. They get the credit and the training, but they also get the recommendations that are tied to the African Union's 50 kilograms per hectare milestone. And so here the case is the African Union's recommendation worthwhile for these farmers? Does it have good value for these farmers in this region in Ghana? And so I bring up these two examples because I feel like having an evaluation that is not already, that doesn't have policy questions already baked in, is maybe it's not really an ideal scenario where then you'd have to fall back to the exercise of translating, where it can be avoided by having the right people around the table early enough in the process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Malik. And now, before we open for questions, I would like to take advantage of being the moderator, and I would like to ask you a question, and you, all of you or who feel sort of like want to answer this question, is about yesterday some of us participated in one of the panel sessions about scaling, and you were touching upon, some of you were touching about, like when we talk about impacts, we talk about shifts, we talk about changes, but we talk about also number of women. So I just wanted to reflect, when you think about impact, do you see mostly as generating changes, or are sort of like reaching a lot of, people that is targeted through an intervention? And how those two approaches sort of complement, and when we think about impact, what should be sort of like focus on, more changes or more of sort of like numbers in terms of sort of like people, farmers, or women that are reached? And also a question that I like from the panel yesterday was like, should we think about measuring impact differently if we are assessing a pilot intervention versus if we are assessing an intervention that has been scaled up? So I just would like to hear, your thoughts on these 2 points, and then we will open for questions to the participants. So I don't know who would like to take one of these questions. Over to you, Mike.
Take a stab at this. Okay. So yeah, I was in that scaling session yesterday. I mean, there clearly isn't a widely accepted definition of scaling, and it's a word that's being used in all different sort of forums. I mean, I do think of it as definitely in terms of numbers is at the World Bank. That's where the direction, that's sort of the line of sight is. They want to reach more. Obviously with the impacts not diminished. Now that's, of course, you can't have both sometimes, but you can get close. And I think that's an area where more and more of us, we're trying to sort of identify what is that minimum viable product, the thing that can travel across a big system and reach large numbers of people. And sometimes, you have to sort of try to understand how can you learn along the way to reduce the complexity of your really cool pilot or the really high impact intervention such that it can be transmitted and reached to reach a larger number of people. So, that's the process that we've been iterating on, for example, in the personal initiative training, where yes, these exciting results from Togo were, really impressive, but then we tried to adapt it in different contexts. We tried it with the TVET system in Ethiopia, and it didn't have the same effect, right? And part of it is around quality of the delivery of the training. And then, we tried it with adolescent girls. We're trying it with farmers. We're trying to see to what extent is it robust to context and to different settings so that you can then, build it into existing systems. But I think, when thinking about this stuff, that's why I think more of a focus on cost is something that we all need to be thinking about from the start. That's not to say that the initial innovation doesn't need to, can of course be ideally this transformational approach, but you need to think about how can it be built at a large scale. But I want to, and I've been thinking about this a good bit, like I don't want the sort of evidence-based policy sort of shift to go towards small tweaks and little things at the margins, because there are there will be a need for some of these bigger push kind of economic inclusion programs, other interventions like childcare that, yes, might have a high upfront cost, and there are going to be frictions, and there are going to be political economy issues in terms of getting something up and running. But I think the long-run impacts of these things in terms of gender equality outcomes and broader development outcomes is pretty compelling. So these are the things that are kind of worth, fighting for and advocating for.
Okay, thank you. I wondered if anyone else wants to comment, or should we open for questions? Oh, perfect. So we have like around 15 minutes for questions. So please feel free to raise your hand. So we have 1, 2, and if anyone else.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of the panelists. This has been a very insightful conversation. I personally am very much involved in the monitoring, evaluation, and impact measurement of the firm that I work with, Shared Planet. So it's been very interesting to hear the different perspectives. But I do have a question for the panelists. Especially when it comes to, obviously, generation of evidence. It is a very critical component to achieving more evidence-based policymaking, programming, and so on. But we also know that monitoring and evaluation as a sector has been historically quite problematic, and reflecting many times the projects and priorities of donors, as opposed to the realities of local communities. Now, obviously, this was historically the case. There's been a lot of efforts towards changing this and towards achieving better evaluation systems, but these things still persist. And so when we consider the concept of generating evidence, we're really talking about the time, effort, livelihoods, and privacy of local communities, of women, farmer households, all of these different, which we call obviously participants. So my question to the panelists is, how can we achieve collectively, and starting with the donors on the table, to achieve more equitable, localized, and also decolonial measuring systems that really center the definitions of impact of local communities, but also in a realistic way, because I know, as you mentioned, as one of the panelists mentioned, this is also quite expensive as a way to really truly engage communities from the get-go in the design, inception, and so on. So my question, is how can we achieve better and just evaluation systems in a realistic way, starting with who funds these projects? Thank you.
And there was a second question.
Thank you very much for the panel. Indeed, I agree that all the takeaways and learnings that you've shared, I think they're quite relevant, because funding is a vital part of how can we change into social outcomes. And my question is precisely related to a new type of movement that is now being moved, that is called multi-capital strategies and systemic investment. And my question is, thinking of the return of investment, that generally it's in economic terms. Now, if we're thinking of social inclusion, there should be also social outcomes, as also Michael was saying, that well-being, in fact, increased much more returns of investment, but in other ways that we hadn't not thought of. So my question is, how has that been part of the conversation now also with the donors? Are these multi-capital strategies or other capital outcomes, returns of investment, tools exist out there, or indicators? Thank you.
And I think we can take the 4 questions, and then it's one here and one there.
Thanks. So I just kind of want to add to what you just said, because I think for those of us working on the ground, I mean, we know what works. We know what works, and it's not what's being funded. We know that we need to start working with the people on the ground from the beginning, even in the design of projects. We know that what's sustainable is something that's deeply embedded, and we know that while certain tweaks, like providing childcare, are really effective and really important, that for holistic long-term change, we need this bigger investment up front. And what was I going to say? We have an example, for example, one of the studies that we did, and I'm not going to name the country, where titles have been issued to women and men for 30 years now. And when we went in and looked at what that meant over time, we found that it was back to men owning the land, because there was no additional change, there was no additional work on the norms and women's empowerment and leadership and things like this. So we know that the solution has to be a holistic one to really be long-term change. So how can we convince you all to invest in those processes, and given the difficulties of measurement over the long term, for real change over time?
Okay, thank you. We have one more.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wonderful questions. My name's Erin. I'm with Responsible Innovations, and thank you so much for the presentations today. You're all amazing leaders at major institutions that shape a lot of our work, not just in the gender space, but overall, internationally, in so many different ways in the agricultural and agri-food system spaces. And I was just wondering if you had any insight for us that are working in gender and often trying to make the case for why GESI is so important in larger institutions, and where the advocates for gender in our institutions, where often there's a battle around funding and priorities. And how do you mainstream it? Like, I love, Inga, what you said around hardwiring equity into our institutions. But often, not everyone thinks the way we think. And I wonder if anyone had an example of when you met a challenge or someone who didn't believe that considering social dimensions is so important in the social outcomes we strive for, and how you overcame that or how you changed minds. I would certainly learn a lot from that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have the first question about sort of like more equitable monitoring systems. So I wonder who would like to start with that question.
I can give that a stab. I absolutely agree. I think the first question was from there. There is a real problem. I'm not necessarily aligned with the fact that it's being solved over time. I think in some ways it's deepening in terms of geographic inequality in the sense. From my position at OCP, we're seeing that the gap in terms of expertise is widening. The gap in terms of intimacy, which is a big player in who gets accepted and who doesn't get accepted in competitive rounds of funding, is also not being fixed. And so, from a donor perspective, it's pretty comfortable if you know that a given grantee has the infrastructure to deal with the requirements that you have and the bureaucracy, and has enough runway financially that if something happens, it can be manageable. It's easy to fall into that as opposed to go the more effective route long term, which is to help local grantees in the global south, in sub-Saharan Africa, and regions that typically don't get super far in competitive rounds with big donors, to help them in their journey to build the kind of infrastructure that they need. In terms of expertise, from the JPAL perspective, experimental impact assessment is, levies a really high kind of entry barrier. So people, to have access to the resources, to get the training, to then have the funds to run a randomized control trial, which is often very expensive in terms of time and money, is not accessible to everyone. And so I think Raquel is here with us. She's one of the people leading the Scholars Program, one of which is the African Scholars Program. I think I'll take the space now to invite anyone who would like to journey into experimental impact assessment, randomized control trials, get some training, some funding access to give submitting a proposal for a pilot a chance, and maybe running the pilot, converting it later into a randomized control trial. Come speak to me. We have an open round to accept African scholars, but I also think that the efforts should be redoubled in terms of assisting grantees, like institutions, to build the infrastructure and the capacity to be competitive, and also in terms of localizing expertise, because I also agree that if you don't localize your expertise, you're going to be missing a lot of things that are lived in the ground. I join the lady that spoke to that later.
Okay, thank you. We had the second question about how we should focus also on the social outcomes rather than only on the economic outcomes when it comes to evaluation and to assess impact. So I wondered who would like to reflect on that? You might go.
Oh, anyone else? Okay. Yeah, so this is I sort of want to tie the two questions together on the social dimensions and then sort of the point about, the other complement, the other barriers and constraints that, if you don't take into account, to use the land titling example, you're going to meet with failure. So I think, I think for particularly with the evidence that we're generating and preparing, we have to communicate to different constituencies in different ways. So when I am with the finance ministry, oftentimes they're going to want to know what are the economic effects of this, how is this contributing to my development strategy, et cetera. Sometimes when we can find a champion within that ministry, of course we will also bring up the very important empowerment impacts that might not have the monetary value attached to them. But I just want to give an example of work in Uganda I've been doing with Kate Ambler from IFPRI and Kelly Jones for a while. We tested different ways of bringing women into agricultural value chains in cash crop farming and sugarcane farming in Uganda. And a simple intervention that just encourages men to put their wives' name on a sugarcane contract yielded substantial impacts in terms of women's resources, agency, achievement, sort of this Kabir framework of empowerment, right? And this type of intervention also didn't reduce production. Because sometimes there's this assumption that, if you're bringing more women into this value chain, the production value will drop, it's going to be a net loss for the household, and you're immiserizing them. So, when we're talking with the government counterparts in some ministries, we might emphasize more this point about, look, you can still bring more women in, they're gaining these decision-making power, there's greater harmony within the household, less conflict. We even tested the GALS approach, right, another kind of gender-intentional approach to try to address these underlying constraints. And then you also bring, with some quarters, some audiences, we emphasize, and it's also, it brings all this empowerment impacts, but it's not leading to this drop in income or drop in agricultural output. So, but I also agree that, this is definitely a dimension that we should all be working towards. It's just that in certain quarters, it's still the instrumental arguments that hold sway. And then, I think on the norms piece, there's a lot that we definitely need to do around this question. I think we're learning a lot. We have a lot more of these engaging men interventions. You're learning from edutainment interventions, from some of these sort of efforts to change attitudes. But yeah, part of this is a long, slow, endogenous, country-driven approach of endogenous social change, right? And so that gets to the point I think you're making about the importance of bringing in the local ecosystem, the local research actors, the partners that really actually also are contributing to advancing. And we're not really talking much about feminist groups and women's groups, but they are playing a huge role in that process. So I think these are not mutually exclusive. They can be really strong and reinforcing complements.
Okay, and I think, Inga, you wanted to add a comment on that?
Yeah, just on the importance also of social outcomes. I really liked the question and the comment. And I would say, there's really, it's not an either or. With, over 30 million farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and this huge inequality gap, we can't afford not to really scale out. We need the magnitude, but we also, need to scale up, look at how we develop inclusive policies, how do we design inclusive finance mechanisms, and then how we scale deep, right? That's really about being courageous enough to tackle those real structural barriers, and I find that's how how brave are we to really go deep into addressing that? And just on that, just to share one example, oftentimes I think it's sometimes we are so projectized and we're too localized that donors need to see those big numbers and the magnitude. But what I find that we can do is we can co-locate. We can coordinate efforts across organizations in specific areas. And this takes long, I realize, and it's quite exhausting. But we have a project now in Zambia and Malawi where we're trying to do that in sustainable soil and water management. So we're actually working with many local delivery partners to do this, and it's an institutional commitment to co-locate and to share resources and to actually redesign our programming. Because it's that system level, we can say, okay, we want to, increase yield, for women farmers, or we want to increase their household income. But then there's the unintended consequence, of, land rights, tenure. And then if you address that, then there's the unintended consequence of something else. And then nothing can be achieved because the whole system is corrupt. So what do we do? So I think there's, short of getting into this doom and gloom mindset, I think there's a lot more that can be done if partners agree to scale in a coordinated and an inclusive way.
Thank you. And I think Jonas and Lynn,
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly reflect on the monitoring and evaluation and also how to measure the impact of interventions. There is like big obsession on randomized controlled trials. That's scaring off many people. I understand. I work with JPAL. JPAL is like RCT or no research. I respect that. RCTs are one important tool, but there are solid other causal inference methods, quasi-experimental methods that are way cheaper and also can be quickly done. Regression discontinuity designs, difference in differences, instrumental variables, estimation methods. My understanding is that many of these global south institutions, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, the understanding and how to implement them and how to conduct them is almost zero. I've done this assessment a while ago. So because of that, we've started a new initiative, a course on causal inference 1 and 2, started giving it online. We offered 2 courses so far, like in August, one on panel data econometrics, how to identify causal, how to make causal inference using panel data methods. There were 700 people participated from all over the world. Causal inference, randomized controlled trials, right a month ago, like in September. So we're going to have another one on quasi-experimental methods, like these methods that I described, because my understanding is that the awareness about them, how to implement them, is not there, so there's quite a lot of capacity to be created. If you are interested in your institutions, please check us on LinkedIn, on my personal homepage. I post this information regularly. Thank you.
I actually wanted to just go ahead and respond to the next question, if that's all right, around kind of, those of you that are working on the ground know what's sustainable. How do you convince us as donors? I completely understand. Yeah, you want to convince us, and you feel like maybe this is the opportunity to try to convince me. And I'm one person representing women's empowerment and agricultural development at the Gates Foundation, and you can convince me of certain things at the margins, but I will say I work for a private family foundation that is chaired by Bill Gates, and Bill Gates is not an easy man to convince of a lot of things. And I didn't realize until I joined the Gates Foundation that he, as the chair of this family foundation, spending his money, he is extremely involved in everything. And while I have a certain level of autonomy over my portfolio, he, if I were to say, I'm going to propose that we invest in XYZ, and we want a 10-year time frame because we want to be more patient with these approaches to really look at changing social norms. It's probably not going to fly because Bill Gates is not a patient man, and therefore the people that report to him at the highest levels, they're not patient. Everyone is reporting up to him. I'm just being very frank with you guys, that I operate within this sort of corporate culture that's not extremely flexible. So it's not about me and what you have to convince me of necessarily, It's about the culture of my organization. And so happy to have a conversation with anyone about that. You know, and I think it's like that for any donor, right? Everyone has their corporate culture. We're all unique. And there may be some donors that have more flexibility. But I think someone said yesterday that there are very few patient donors left. And I think that really rang true with me. You know, there maybe were some before, but now, man, it's harder than ever. And I had hoped when I joined, I thought private philanthropy, maybe there's more patience, sort of it's apolitical, and you can be more patient with this, like, you know, private philanthropy. But I don't see that happening, just so you know, in the Gates Foundation. And then to the colleague asking about how do you make the case for Jesse in your institutions, I think it's such an important question, and it's important in these kinds of fora that we talk about this. I didn't come up in my career as a Jesse professional. I found my way into this path because I felt, you know, both in the workplace and in my work programmatically, that this was so critical and just undervalued. And I think it was really the instrumentalist argument that I found was what was able to convince my colleagues, you know, that is what works with most colleagues in the agriculture space, sort of agriculture economic growth. That's how you'll get through to them, whether it's your colleagues in the office, your colleagues in ministries, and your government counterparts. I was in Malawi 10, 12 years ago when I guess it was 10 years ago when the gender gaps in productivity report came out on, the agricultural gender gaps in productivity report came out from Malawi and Tanzania. And I had been sort of shot down on really focusing on women in agriculture and our agriculture programs there. And people were like, well, you know, why do we need to focus on women, youth, and marginalized groups so much? You know, this isn't a humanitarian program. Like, we really want to be commercially oriented kind of thing. And when that came out, I was really able to make the argument, like, if we really want to finally increase productivity for the country, look at what we need to do. And this report really outlines it. And the ministry was able to get on board other donors, and I was able to convince my leadership with that. And that's how I got my footing in this space on gender and agriculture. And from there, you know, was able to go. So I think it's that instrumentalist argument: convince people, convince your leaders, have the data, be confident.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for being in this plenary, and thank you so much for our speakers. Thanks for these useful insights, and we can continue the conversation and the discussions during the coffee break. Please go to Aldi for the coffee break. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.